United Way Mass Bay is determined to make an impact, to inspire communities to be the very best versions of themselves. They listen to the voices that can actually make that happen. Community leaders, educators, and the neighbors that live, work, and thrive in these places. Those are the voices that matter, and those are the voices that United Way Mass Bay listens to. And because they're listening, they're creating a new kind of philanthropy. See what's new at unitedwaymassbay.org/what's new.
We all know how difficult it can be to get from point A to point B in Massachusetts, especially if you're out in Western Mass. Cars aren't an option for everybody, trains serve denser areas, and even regional bus networks have some limited coverage. Public transportation options could expand, but only with significant investments of time and money. Enter Microtransit, one option for communities to provide public transportation to people who fall through those cracks. I'm Jennifer Smith, and you're listening to the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's weekly podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm joined by Jen Healy, the Rural Transit Program Manager at the Quaboag Valley Community Development Corporation. She recently co-authored a Commonwealth Beacon op-ed arguing for more funding for microtransit. So today, we're discussing microtransit and the context of all of the transit modes in Western Massachusetts and the state more broadly. How do they fit together? How don't they? And what can we do to fill those gaps? Jen, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
So we love to start basic here and then really complicate everything. So what is microtransit?
It's a big question. I would say that microtransit is a bit of an umbrella term for these smaller, more flexible transportation systems. Oftentimes they are on demand versus fixed route, which is what I think most people think of as public transportation. You go to the bus stop and it picks you up and takes you to a predetermined stop. Many microtransit systems operate more on an appointment-based system. So you're in a designated area that is served by a microtransit system, and you make an appointment and you're picked up usually at your home and taken to your destination. So they can look a lot of different ways, which is something that's fun about them, but mostly they're smaller and more flexible transportation systems.
And so what other models might people be seeing if they're in an area with available microtransit? I'd imagine plenty of people often associate the ride, interestingly, the Massachusetts MBTA option, the ride, as kind of a version of microtransit.
Absolutely. And I think that that could certainly fit in. Some of the models you'll see sort of in the western part of the state, the Franklin Regional Transit Authority actually runs a microtransit program. It's called the FRTA Access Program. That model has both that sort of demand response, we go to you and pick you up and take you somewhere option. And it also has an option that just circulates in a smaller area. That's a version of microtransit. You may also just see different structures. So that one is housed in an RTA. The Tri-Town connector out in the Great Barrington area is housed in the municipality of Great Barrington. And then you might also see something like, I call the Quaboag connector demand response. On demand is a little bit different. On demand transportation is more real time, something like Uber or Lyft, but public transportation. So you might see that model as well. The Quaboag connector asks for folks to call us about 48 hours in advance, but there are some programs that are ready to go pick someone up within an hour or something like that. The vehicles are live and they can sort of deviate to you. That's also a type of microtransit.
So speaking both for the Quaboag connector, but then also microtransit more generally, who tends to identify these gaps between public transit hubs that might be a good fit? How do those end up kind of bubbling up in the first place?
You know, I think that's part of why microtransit is so exciting, because it's a broad range of organizations and sort of community members and stakeholders that identify them. Our regional transit system, the RTAs, cover a huge amount of the Commonwealth, and they provide lifeline services to so many communities. That said, decades of sort of underinvestment have caused these gaps in service. Particularly, we find, at least in our area, where RTA territories sort of start to meet. Sometimes you have some gaps there, and certainly the Quaboag Valley is one of those. We sit between the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority and the Worcester Regional Transit Authority, and a little bit south of the Franklin Regional Transit Authority. And there was not much service in our area at all. And so in our case for the Quaboag connector, it took like 10 years of conversations about the really terrible challenges that folks were facing in our area due to a lack of public transportation, for folks to start to say, what can we actually do about it? And that's sort of where the Quaboag connector came from. Like I said, the Quaboag Valley Community Development Corporation is all about improving the quality of life in the Quaboag Valley. Transportation, they found at the time, fit squarely within that mission. And so they sort of took up the mantle. But you also see municipalities, of course. We have had longstanding partners in the healthcare community, particularly the Health Foundation of Central Massachusetts and Bay State Wing Hospital have always been partners with the Quaboag connector and provided us funding and resources. So you see a lot of healthcare organizations looking into transportation lately because folks can't get to medical appointments. But then there are also local employers who are interested in making sure their employees or potential employees can get to work. There are folks who, work in food justice who want to make sure that people can access the grocery store and access healthy groceries. It's a really broad space. And I think especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, where things were exacerbated and highlighted, some of these inequalities were highlighted, we see just such a variety of organizations and community members saying transportation is a real issue here. How do we get involved? And that's sort of where these microtransit initiatives have come from in a lot of cases.
I'm so interested in kind of the patchwork of transit options here. So as some background, I went to high school in a place that had free public buses, but then those systems have also increasingly kind of been replaced by and reliant on microtransit options. And the argument there is that it actually has been kind of a one or the other situation. You lose some bus lines, you increase some microtransit options. When you talk about how long some of these microtransit programs take to get going, it's no mystery to anybody in Massachusetts getting any kind of transit system going in Massachusetts is just a lifetime or a decade or more of work. So how do you think about kind of what the best suited transit option is for the area? And then is this making a case to kind of say we're shooting lower than pushing for an RTA, or if you could get an RTA, would you want one? Like kind of help me situate where these are all connecting.
Sure. I think firstly, we've seen some really exciting changes even this year alone in just the way that the state is looking at transportation. So I mentioned the sort of chronic underinvestment in the regional transit system. The budget that is being discussed right now in the legislature, we saw some real change of tides there in, sort of deeper investment in the regional transit system. In the past, several years, we've had the community transit grant program and the new, but also being debated in the legislature, regional transit innovation grant. Those are all really great initiatives and are really showing, I think, a sort of change in how we look at transportation. That said, for a very long time, it was underinvested in, and also the real driving metric to determine success was ridership, which makes some sense, right, on its face. But in more rural areas, I can never give you the ridership numbers that Boston can, or Worcester, or really even like a Northampton or a Greenfield can give you. And so what you're going to see is that when the budget is tight, services in rural areas are the ones that are going to be cut because ridership is the metric. However, people in rural areas still need to go places. They still need to access resources. And with fewer options, sometimes, the impact is even greater because they have no other option of how to get to the doctor, get to work, get to the grocery store. And so I think when we look at what's going to work best in an area, you want sort of everybody at the table. You want the RTAs at the table. You want folks working in microtransit at the table. Senior centers and councils on aging have played a really big role, at least with us, for sort of driving this kind of microtransit piece. But rural areas have some very real challenges that don't lend themselves to what we think of as sort of traditional public transportation, right? A big bus is not going to do well on some country roads. And people that have to get to a bus stop in a rural area might have to walk down a, mile-long driveway to get there. And, maybe walking down that driveway is not a possibility for them. Destinations are further apart. There are fewer resources. There are fewer sort of hubs for a typical bus route to stop in. And so I think what has to happen is you have to really look at what is going to work best in the area. And also, you need to talk to the community members. We did a lot of interviewing, a lot of surveying, especially sort of at the beginning, to say, what is it that you all need? Where do you need to go? And you really need to take that feedback and listen to folks, because folks in rural areas also aren't accustomed to transportation necessarily being safe or being, it's not familiar to them. And so in listening to our community, we heard that they wanted to be able to call a phone line and hear a human's voice to tell them how the system works. They needed more communication, and they needed to not sort of be left with like an hour wait time or something like that. You don't want to go to the grocery store and have your groceries be spoiled by the time the bus comes back around. So it really needs to be everybody's at the table. What resources do we have in the area that can be used? And what would a successful transportation system in the area look like? Oftentimes, I think it's going to be a combination of things. In the Quaboag connector example, we have our demand response service. People really love that service. They love that a lot of times they recognize the drivers because they live in the area. They love that the vehicles are smaller. They love that they still can get an appointment. Usually they don't have to wait too long. We do get booked up sometimes, but they don't have to wait too long to access the resources that they need. But we only travel locally, right, in those 10 towns. We also partner with the PVTA on their B79 route, which goes from Amherst, the UMass Amherst campus, to Union Station in Worcester. So a really great way that this can work is the Quaboag connector brings people to the bus stops for the B79. They can get to Union Station in Worcester and then travel on from there. There's lots of talk about passenger rail in Western Mass. We fully anticipate bringing people to the train station in Palmer. So I think if I can wave a magic wand, there's a combination of services, right? Folks in rural areas need to travel too, and they need options that are not sort of the minimum requirements, right? They deserve clean, reliable, timely transportation that they feel good using. So I think it's always going to be a combination of services, but I do think something that's really exciting about microtransit is that it is proven in several places in the state now to be a really viable option for these more rural communities where fixed route transportation just doesn't really work, isn't cost effective, doesn't work well for the people that are living there.
So there was a lot in there, and I'm going to pull apart a few different threads. So I think to first think about kind of how this even gets going in the first place, you mentioned that this was a really long process to get microtransit in this area. There are so many reasons that something can be a very long process: cost, political will. It's a headache and a half for anything to start to happen out in Western Massachusetts often. So what was the actual advocacy process and then the development process looking like for getting this microtransit in the region in this kind of, desert between these three RTAs?
Yeah. The catalyst was a grant, to be honest. These conversations had been happening for a long time, I think a decade. This part precedes me, but about a decade, folks have been talking about the problem with transportation. Employers couldn't get employees, folks couldn't get to medical appointments, things like that. And so there was a grant opportunity, and the Quaboag connector started with, a vehicle, one person on the other end of a phone line recording, appointments with a pencil and a pad of paper. That's how it started. And it started with 5 rides the first month that we operated. That was January 2017. But I will say, to illustrate just how much need there is for this, 5 rides in January. By December of that year, monthly totals were reliably over 600 or 700. These days, it's about 1,100 on average. And that's only because I'm out of vehicles and staff is hard to find. It could certainly be more than that. So the grant was the catalyst, but it was the town being invested, QVCDC being invested, working with the senior center who has let us borrow their van pretty much the entire time the connector has existed. Healthcare organizations were involved. other community organizations, other human services stakeholders were involved. Rural areas are really good at collaborating because they have to. So people wear a lot of hats. We see a lot of the same people in all of our meetings. So that collaboration pushed it forward and it was able to start, which I think is the big obstacle with transportation. Is a high barrier to entry. But once it got going and folks realized it was trustworthy and reliable and they could actually use it, it was practical for them to use it, it took off. And our partnerships have only sort of increased and become more robust as the years have gone on, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years. And that was because in 2019, we received another grant from the Health Foundation of Central Massachusetts, which is 5 years. And I believe it totals over $2 million now that they've invested in the Quaboag connector.
Has the state funding kept up as well? Because, of course, as you're talking about the investment in RTAs, it's also always balanced. This is a tricky revenue universe right now. How are we doing on the money side on the state level?
Yes, so the Community Transit Grant Program out of MassDOT has funded a good portion of the connector for many years now. That's a really excellent grant program. You can apply for operating funds for capital expenditures like vehicles. And you can also, which was new last year, you can apply for what's called mobility management, which is all about helping folks navigate the transportation system. So that could, as opposed to physically moving people with your vehicles, it's, helping folks realize what services are available to them, helping them understand how to use it, connecting them with travel training or connecting them with resources so that they can better move about the Commonwealth based on their needs. It's a fantastic grant program. And then we also, the new Regional Transit Innovation Grant, we also applied for, and we didn't get one of the awards that was directly from that grant, but we were one of the projects that was then funded through some expansion funds of the Community Transit Grant Program for our RTIG proposal. So the state has very much been involved, and that funding is great. What I will say is that in something like transportation, where reliable levels of service are necessary for folks to plan around it and to trust your service year over year, and where big capital purchases have to be made, grant funding is challenging in that there is some uncertainty every single year about how much funding we'll be able to get, right? Even if we have these close partnerships, which we do, and folks are supportive, which they are, there's always a little bit of chance that the money just wasn't there. And then I have to tell folks that I know we've been running these hours for the last 7 years, but we have to cut them back. Or I know we usually have 2 vehicles on the road at this time, but we can only do 1. That hasn't happened yet, fingers crossed, but it is something that I think these smaller microtransit initiatives are so impactful and so exciting, but there's not yet a mechanism, at least at the state level, for them to become sustainably funded year after year, the way that, an RTA receives some funding every single year for sure. So the grant programs have been amazing. The state has been involved and has very much empowered the connector, but grant funding is a little uncertain always.
If we could get a little bit meta now, thinking about the different ways that transit systems interact with each other, I appreciate that you brought up kind of the concept of Uber or Lyft or ride shares or something like that, because one of the things that the MBTA did, I think it was 7 years ago now, if I'm remembering the billboards correctly, was there was a program through the ride that would let you basically call an Uber or Lyft to plug the gaps that were still left from the ride, also plugging gaps. But I guess I'm curious on a broader level about how rideshare as a concept has or hasn't ended up helping making the case for public investment in this kind of transportation system.
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say, I think I'm all for acknowledging the gaps and for innovating in terms of how do we connect people to what they need. At the end of the day, you just need people to be able to access resources, and beyond access resources, I want people to be able to go see their friends and family. Whatever combination of structures and systems makes that happen is exciting. Out here in rural areas of the state, this is the story that I tell everybody that I speak to, really, is we had somebody try to call an Uber home from a hospital a few years ago. And it said that it was going to take 24 hours to arrive and cost $400.
Oh, God.
So taxi services even, but certainly rideshare services are not that available to rural residents. I will say I think that the rideshare concept has probably brought people around to the idea of demand response transportation for the general public a bit more. I think a lot of folks, when we first started, thought that our buses were only for seniors or only for people with disabilities, which is not the case. It's for everybody. So I do think rideshare has brought people around to this idea that, oh, that is a way that we can move from place to place. But I will say that, cost is a barrier if it's certainly if you're paying full price for an Uber or a Lyft regularly. And also 40% of our rides are for people over 60. Over a quarter, I think 27% are for people with disabilities. And a rideshare driver isn't necessarily equipped to help those folks. And their vehicles aren't necessarily equipped to help those folks if they have mobility devices that they use, or mobility aids that they use. And so it's exciting to be looking for innovative ways to move folks around. But I also think we need to remember like who needs transportation the most and who is, going to be disadvantaged by something like using rideshare, because they might not, the driver might not have the skills, the vehicle might not be accessible. So yeah, I would say I think it's brought people around to this idea that demand response, on-demand transportation could be for everybody and is a really good option for filling some gaps that do exist. But I also think we need to make sure that it works for everybody.
So we also briefly touched on the long promised, and now there is a new specific director of the East-West or West-East, depending on what name you're using, rail system here. So how have you been kind of watching that project be promised, start to unfold? What's it mean for you in kind of creating a new spine, or is it still leaving some pretty substantial gaps here?
It's excellent news. We're really excited about it, and we've been plugged into it pretty much the whole time. We have partners that worked on the West East Rail initiative closely through the studies that were being done and the advocacy. And when they did their traveling sort of listening sessions, I spoke to a couple of those about our work with the connector. I think everyone is really excited about the opportunity of having a rail option out here that could connect us onto the rest of the Commonwealth. That said, folks need to get to those train stations. So at the connector, the Quaboag connector, our sort of piece of that has always been we fully expect to be driving folks to the Palmer rail stop that is planned. Palmer's one of our service area towns, and we know from experience that a lot of folks can't get to Palmer without the Quaboag connector. So it has been about advocating for that and about planning for the future when probably a large piece of what we do is bringing people to that rail stop and then bringing them home. Because I think, again, we have RTA service out here. We have bus lines out here, particularly, Springfield, Northampton, and Amherst. But some folks can't get to those bus lines. Similar with rail, we're very excited to have it. We have to make sure people can get there to use it. So that's sort of been our piece of that. But we've worked very closely with the advocates for West East Passenger Rail. So I'm excited to see it unfold. Yeah.
I think the last thing sort of on that note that I wanted to be sure to hit on is kind of the simultaneous planning processes here. Has it been a smooth process to kind of watch East-West Rail, West-East Rail kind of unfold? There have been kind of questions about scheduling, when it would actually end up happening. So how is that all kind of unfolded from your perspective if you need to start planning about, hey, when are we going to start to need to get people to these stations?
Yeah, I've been less connected to the sort of scheduling piece of it. But I will say that the Quaboag connector was mostly involved in pushing for the Palmer rail stop, knowing our residents and knowing that they need this to be able to travel, pushing for the Palmer rail stop and, being able to say, if you put this rail stop here, we can get people to it is also part of that. And then we were also involved in when they were initially doing ridership studies, and sort of testing that out and making sure that it accurately captured the need. Because I think sometimes it's important to remember with transportation that folks adapt to what is available to them. So we have a population out here sometimes that doesn't have a transportation option or didn't for a very long time. And so you might ask them, well, if they're, how is transportation for you? Is that a challenge? They might say no, because they've already adapted to it. But then if you push a little and you say things like, well, if you had to go to the doctor, what would you do? And that's when you start to hear answers like, well, I'd have to make sure that my son-in-law could drive me that day, or, I'd have to use the car, so and so would have to take off work, or, I'd have to ask my neighbors for a ride. And I don't really like to do that. It's vulnerable or something like that. Then you start to see the need. And so I think, we were involved in sort of making sure that the need was captured, that an accurate picture of who would be using the rail was captured out here, and then pushing for that Palmer rail stop and, sort of saying this is something that we are planning for. That said, I think once that Palmer rail stop goes in, I'm going to need a few more vehicles and some more staff, which is always a challenge. But that's been most of my involvement on that end.
Right. It's always a very interesting kind of conception of transit stops are not just for the people who live immediately near it, but who might, be a stop, whatever a stop is away. So I guess, does your kind of ridership constituency feel like it's captured usually when the question of demand comes up, when the question of, how many people are going to need to be at that Palmer stop? Did you have to say you need to draw this circle a little bit wider than just who lives within half a mile of this?
Yes, I think it's tough to quantify. I certainly see that. It's a challenge. But I do think there is enormous possibility here. Like I said, we do about 1,000 or 1,100 rides a month because I'm out of vehicles to put on the road all at once, right? The demand is very much there. The Quaboag connector alone cannot meet it. And so, yeah, saying, these folks aren't even able to consider certain employment opportunities yet, visiting family, we have folks who have moved into our service area so that they could use the connector to go to medical appointments because they had routine medical appointments. I think we need to keep in mind when the option is there, folks will be able to plan their lives a little bit differently around it. So, we have housing, not very much, but in this part of the state, there's slightly more housing availability than in the eastern part of the state. Sometimes folks get placed here and then they can't commute to work, right? But you have passenger rail, you have microtransit initiatives like the Quaboag connector that can maybe connect them to RTA services too, depending on what's available in the area, and suddenly their world opens up. So yeah, drawing that circle bigger, understanding that folks adapt to what is available to them because they have to when it comes to moving from place to place, and realizing the possibility that something like West East Rail presents for folks to just have additional options, I think is really important. And yes, that is what we were saying, sort of think about this, think about the folks in the hill towns that if they could get a ride to a rail stop, they could then go on to Boston, or they could go to New York City, or, Hartford, things like that, just understanding the different movement patterns in the more rural areas, and that if you have a reliable option, people are going to use it. It's very much needed, and folks will latch on as soon as it's available to them.
Thanks again to Jen Healy for being on the Codcast with me. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is John Gee. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us. And email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back in your ears next week.